This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour, and welcome to Unique Scotland, the go-to podcast on all things Scottish. And I'm delighted to have you with me on this second part of my tour of the Scottish borders. I mentioned before that I believe that this area does not get the recognition it deserves, and most tourists head for the Northern Highlands and the islands such as Skye. Well, I hope to put that right, and if you get the opportunity whilst visiting Scotland, the Borders region is one you should spend some time in, and this Unique Scotland podcast will give you an insight into this lovely area. Today I'm broadcasting this from my study in Aberlady, in East Lothian, a beautiful part of Scotland and adjacent to the wonderful sandy beaches of the North Sea coast. With nature reserves, golf courses and some extraordinary historical sites, this area is worthy of a podcast on its own. So I've decided to delay my Glasgow series, which should be next, and to bring you East Lothian as my next venture. I'll let you know more about it at the end of the podcast. It's now the middle of September, and officially autumn. Well, blow me down, after weeks of rain, the sun has come out, and the forecast for the coming week is good, so let's not knock Scottish weather altogether. You can tell that autumn approaches because as I walk down by Aberlady Bay Nature Reserve, the wonderful sound of greylag and pink-footed geese squawking overhead warn of the changing season as they arrive in their thousands to overwinter in this part of Scotland. It's a hugely impressive sight to see the numerous V formations arriving in the bay. Of course, there are also other arrivals in the form of black clouds of swarming starlings who conduct an amazing swirling dance in the sky, making beautiful formations that change within seconds as they gracefully pirouette together in a mesmerising murmuration. Such incredible beauty. And now to another kind of beauty as we continue our tour around the borders. I'm going to take up where we left off at the amazing Jedburgh Abbey, after which we'll drive to another lovely ruin at Melrose, and I'll let you know a little more about the lives of the monks who lived in these places to give you an insight into monastic life. And where does Robert the Bruce's heart feature in all of this? We'll also look at the towns of Jedburgh and Melrose that have so much to offer, and we'll then head over to have a look at Abbotsford House, the home of Sir Walter Scott, the most celebrated Scottish author of his generation. I was delighted to meet a modern author on one of my tours recently, Mary Ann Edwards, and she is the author of one of the celebrated detective series Charlie McClung, and it was apt that we finished our tour at Abbotsford House, and we'll hear from Mary Ann and her husband Jeff later. I was also very privileged to have with me on my last tour Jim and Linda Wood and their daughters Christy and Ginny, as we toured initially around Edinburgh, then Skye and the Highlands. And they were looking at family history, and I'll be talking to them later. You will be astonished, as were they, to hear how by chance they met a close relative in Scotland. To see some great photos of the border abbeys and castles, then have a look at my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, or my Facebook page or Instagram. And if you listen through my website, please don't forget to subscribe to ensure that you get notification of future episodes. There'll also be short videos of the borders on my YouTube channel, Exclusive Scottish Visits, so please subscribe to get notification of my travels. Thank you to all those who have bought me a coffee recently, and if you wish to contribute to my time and research for these podcasts, you can always join me in buying a coffee. It only costs around $5 or £3.50, and all you do is simply search on your browser buymeacoffee.com/Unique Scotland. That's buymeacoffee.com/Unique Scotland. Any contributions are very much appreciated. Well, wherever you are in the world, I would now like you to relax and to join me on this tour to the picturesque and extraordinary borders of Scotland. You will recall from episode 1 that we had just arrived in Jedburgh, with the extraordinary ruined abbey up on a mound overlooking the town with the Jed water running below. It's a splendid sight, and the church is still intact, albeit with no roof, but beautiful large Gothic arches can be seen stretching from one end to the other, with smaller arches on the 2 stories above. At one end, the square bell tower still stands proudly over the abbey church, which gives it an air of reality, and it's only on closer inspection that we realise that this is simply a shell of a previously beautiful and extraordinary building. Sadly, most of the outbuildings associated with the abbey have long gone, but there's a supermodel of the abbey in the visitor centre to bring the original monastic order to life. It was King David I of Scotland who, in 1118, established the abbey and installed Augustinian canons. And what does it mean to be Augustinian? Well, it means that these canons, who are priests in their own right, by the way, follow the works of St. Augustine. I've done a bit of research on St. Augustine, and he was active in about 400 AD, and that's 750 years before the abbey was built. He was a theologian and a philosopher, and he wrote many important works on Christian doctrine. He was known as Augustine of Hippo, which made me smile slightly because I imagined the poor fellow travelling around the country on a huge hippopotamus in a lumbering fashion. Well, I'm pleased to report that Hippo actually refers to the place Hippo Regius in Numidia, in Roman North Africa. Today, Numidia is known as Algeria, so on your next holiday to that region, take some time out to investigate the Roman occupation and the connection with St. Augustine. It's interesting to note that many Protestants, especially Calvinists and Lutherans, consider St. Augustine, yes, a Catholic saint, as one of the theological fathers of the Protestant Reformation, due to his teachings on salvation and divine grace. Martin Luther, in particular, was an advocate of St. Augustine, and our own John Knox, who followed Luther, led the movement for the Scottish Reformation in 1560, when Scotland transformed from a Catholic to a Protestant country. I'm often asked why such beautiful places like Jedburgh Abbey stand today in ruins. Well, there's a direct connection with this abbey and the Wars of Independence, which saw the abbey severely damaged on a number of occasions due to these wars. It all started with a great king of Scots named Alexander III, and he married Yolande, daughter of the Comte de Dreux, on 14th of October 1285 at Jedburgh Abbey. 1 year later, he would lie dead with a broken neck at the foot of a rocky shore in Fife near a village called Kinghorn. Now, I remember this story because when I was a child, my parents took me and my sisters to Kinghorn Holiday Park, where we stayed in a caravan. It's a small mobile home, effectively. The sand, the sea, the rocks, a stone's throw from the caravan's door, so when we children were out, we were allowed to spend our day roaming free and playing by the sea, within sight of parents, of course. It was a child's paradise, and a place I shall never forget. So when I learned of King Alexander's death in Kinghorn in 1286, it fired my imagination, and I decided to learn the history of that era. And what a story. His death and that of his granddaughter, the Maid of Norway, who should have succeeded him, effectively left Scotland without a monarch, and allowed Edward I of England to flex his muscles and to exert his authority over Scotland. He was asked by the Scottish nobles to select Scotland's next king, and from the noble families of Bruce, Cummin and Balliol, he chose Balliol. Well, King Balliol was treated appallingly by Edward and eventually exiled abroad, leaving Scotland without a king. The vacuum would eventually be filled by Robert the Bruce, but in the meantime, every invading army would slight the abbey on its way north or south. And I love that word, slight. It means destroy, but you get the feeling that the destruction was done in a sort of decent way, which only slightly damaged the infrastructure. Of course, quite the opposite. It normally meant burning the building or taking the roof off or destroying the walls. Anyway, the earliest record of damage was after William Wallace defeated the hugely superior army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. And you'll remember the film Braveheart. Well, the defeated and retreating English army, on fleeing to the English border, heard the bells of Jedburgh Abbey ringing out in jubilation at Wallace's victory. Talk about red rag to a bull. The army swerved right into the path of the abbey and took their revenge by warming themselves in the heat of the bonfire from the burning building. The abbey was repaired, but it was further damaged by the English in 1410, 1416 and 1464. In 1523, the town and abbey were set on fire by the Earl of Surrey during ongoing conflicts between the English and Scots, and for good measure, The Earl of Hertford burned it down in 1544, so you can see how difficult it was in those days to live on the border with England and to retain such an imposing building. The Abbey's end actually came about not from marauding Englishmen, but from one of Scotland's own, John Knox, and his Reformation in 1560, when Catholicism was cast out and Protestantism took its place. In most towns, the stained glass was smashed, the icons destroyed, the separate altars with saints were taken down, and all Catholic emblems were removed. In John Knox's own words, "We want nothing to do with papish idolatry in our places of worship." The monks were allowed to stay until their numbers died out, and no new monks were allowed to be recruited. Part of Jedburgh Abbey did continue to be used as a parish church, but it ceased in 1871 when it was considered to be a dangerous structure, and a new parish church, or kirk, was constructed just across the road. Thankfully, in 1917, some restoration work was conducted to stabilise the Abbey structure, and what you see today is now in the care of Historic Environment Scotland. As well as the Abbey, King David of Scotland also built Jedburgh Castle, near the river at the southern end of the royal borough. It became a royal residence, but it was captured by the English on so many occasions that it was seldom used. However, it's said that a fortune teller attached to the castle had a premonition about King Alexander III's death. If only he had heeded the soothsayer, we may not have had the Wars of Independence. The castle was finally destroyed in 1409 by the Scots to avoid it falling into English hands, and in the 18th century the former medieval fortress became a prison, taking the name of Jedburgh Castle Prison. I have to say I was a bit taken aback to hear the term Jeddart Justice, or Jedburgh Justice, which in the 18th century meant that the town would hang a man first and then try him in court later. A bit strange, but I'm sure it helped cut down a great deal on the paperwork. Then, in 1823, the old medieval castle was demolished and a new jail was built on the site. This 19th century prison is now a museum and worth a visit to see what life would have been like for prisoners in the 1820s. You can trace the history of Jedburgh with displays ranging from archaeological finds to the official town drum and its collection of weights and measures. An interesting place to visit when you are in the town. There are a number of other attractions in the centre of the town, and in the marketplace there's an interesting market cross which replaces the original. It's called the Jubilee Fountain and was erected to honour Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1899. Above the fountain rises a Gothic column, topped by the figure of a unicorn holding the borough coat of arms. And if you look closely nearby, you can see some cobblestones marking the place where the old Market Cross would have been. It's also a good place to stand to get an excellent view of the New Gate, a Harold 18th century gateway built to replace an earlier toll booth or medieval courtroom and prison. The gateway is topped by a spire rising 118 feet with the inscription Newgate Clock Tower circa 1720, and within the spire is a ring of 3 bells. One was brought from the Abbey. Over the Newgate archway is a panel inscribed with the borough arms and the motto Strenu et Proper, or with vigour and success. Under the arch are doors to windowless prisoner cells, and on the next level up is a cell for condemned prisoners. The north arch of the pen bears the painted inscription Entrance to Bridewell Jail, and above it there is a simple date stone inscribed Newgate 1755. Right next door is Jedburgh Sheriff Court, which is an excellent example of an early 19th century county building in the neoclassical or Greek revival style. It was remodelled by the renowned architect David Rind. On the front is a plaque to Sir Walter Scott, who sat here occasionally in his capacity as Sheriff of Selkirkshire, dispensing justice for nearly 30 years until his death in 1832. We'll shortly be going on to see his family home, Abbotsford in Melrose, as we continue our journey. From this central marketplace, it's well worth taking a stroll to what is known as Mary Queen of Scots House. This is a lovely 16th century 3-storey rubble stone-built building with a 4-storey tower. It's believed that Queen Mary stayed here for a few weeks in 1566, and there are records of her paying around £40 for 3 weeks' rent, which I thought was very reasonable, and even considered renting the house myself. Of course, £40 in 1560 in today's money is worth around £17,000, so I've decided to give it a miss. To me, the more interesting story is the connection with her lover, James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Mary heard that Bothwell had been injured in a fight at Hermitage Castle, some 22 miles away from Jedburgh, and she took the hazardous journey on horseback over some very rough countryside and in appalling weather to go and visit him. On her return, she fell ill and nearly died. The reason for her illness did not go unnoticed among the Scottish nobles, and this just added to the general discontent about some of her actions while still married to Lord Darnley. Indeed, during her illness, Lord Darnley tried to visit Queen Mary at Jedburgh, but was prevented from doing so, and the intrigue goes on. I'll stop there because this incredible story of the troubled Mary Queen of Scots will be the subject of a separate podcast. So, after we've spent some time in Jedburgh, the most southerly of the Border Abbeys, we turn around and head north back up the A68 to visit the town of Melrose and have a look at the fine abbey there. On our journey on the A68, and on your left-hand side, you'll see the three peaks of the Eildon Hills getting closer as you approach the town. It's well signposted, and you'll turn left towards the A7 with Melrose at the next major junction on the right. Before we arrive at the town, you'll see a signpost for Newstead on the B6361 road, which is actually the site of an incredible Roman fort complex called Trimontium, or the Three Hills, and takes its name from the three peaks of the Eildon Hills that tower above the site. It was occupied in the 1st and the early 2nd centuries and was a huge army barracks. It sits around 60 miles north of Hadrian's Wall on the England-Scotland border, and also sits on Deer Street, the road built by the Romans to provide logistics to their outposts in the north. This Trimontium complex appears to have occupied some 49 acres, which compares with some other very important Roman sites. It's believed to have been a legionary camp, which would suggest a complement of around 5,000 Roman soldiers, so it was a hugely important staging post for Roman incursions into the north of Scotland. I watched a YouTube video recently called Trimontium Roman Fort, Newstead, which was taken from the air. The fields where the camp used to be are now filled with farmers' crops, but it's the crop marks that reveal a quite amazing array of lines showing exactly where the Roman camp lay and just how large it was. It was in 1846, during the construction of a railway line east of Newstead, that the builders discovered several trenches that contained Roman artefacts. It was clear from the finds that the railway engineers stumbled across a considerable Roman site. However, it was not until 50 years later that an amateur archaeologist named James Curl excavated the site on behalf of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. The artefacts that he discovered were quite incredible, and it's testament to his work that so many of the finds are available to view in the local museum in Melrose and also the Museum of Scotland. A year after his discoveries, he published a paper called A Roman Frontier and Its People, and that remains the most decisive work published in Scotland for that period. He discovered more than 100 pits in which a huge array of artefacts were deposited, including domestic items, military equipment, and even a human body. It's quite poignant standing near the site with the Eildon Hills towering above to imagine Roman legions passing this way, coming from or going to a substantial Roman fort at this point. The site was extremely well chosen, built on a natural mound overlooking the River Tweed and at a crossroads for the traffic moving north and south along the River Leder and east-west along the Tweed. As fortunes and influence changed, the fort became a frontier post, a supply base, a reinforcements base, and with around 500 mounted troops, they could react to threats from any direction. With extensive manufacturing and trading operations within the base, it's clear that this fortress was a formidable presence in the area. If you wish to know more, now you can visit an excellent Trimontium museum in Melrose to see some of the artefacts discovered by archaeological digs, and perhaps take a guided tour of the Roman camp by one of the museum's staff. Well, we enter Melrose a few minutes later. It's a small town with charming shops and sumptuous restaurants, and a great rugby team. The town itself has been here for some time and would have witnessed the Romans arrive in the 1st century and watched a fabulous abbey built here in the 12th century. There's ample parking opposite Melrose Abbey ruins, and it's just so enjoyable having a stroll to see the first-class shops and having lunch in one of the excellent restaurants. I usually park behind Bart's Hotel and enjoy lunch there, but Melrose is not short of excellent restaurants. Turning to the abbey itself, it was founded in 1136 by no other than King David I, with a Cistercian order of monks. Now, the term Cistercian comes from the Latin for Citeaux, near Dijon in eastern France. The Cistercians had broken away from the Benedictine order to return to a stricter way of life, including agriculture and brewing. The monastery had around 100 monks, plus the abbot and other dignitaries. Melrose was the first Cistercian abbey in Scotland, and King David allowed them to select the site to allow for better farming and fishing, and this paid off, because Melrose became extremely wealthy, resulting in succeeding monarchs increasing their lands and their property. Of course, the more wealthy the abbeys became, the more money went into the coffers of the king. Melrose Abbey was built in a Gothic style in the form of a cross. It suffered the same fate as so many Catholic establishments around 1560 during Scotland's Reformation, and this substantial ruin dates from around 1590. Part of the church was used by the local parish for a number of years, but it's now in the hands of Historic Environment Scotland. Melrose Abbey is something to behold, and many Scottish kings and nobles are buried here. But the most interesting burial to me on this site is that of the embalmed heart of Robert the Bruce, Scotland's greatest king, and that was found here in 1921, near to the chapter house. As it happens, the rest of Bruce's body is buried in Dunfermline Abbey. The heart was enclosed in a 9-inch long cone-shaped lead casket, and when opened originally, contained a desiccated heart. What is known of the history of Bruce's remains is that before he died, he directed that his body should be laid to rest at Dunfermline, but that his heart should be sent to Jerusalem so that he could take part in a pilgrimage that he had never been able to do. And in those days, it was important to have been on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. But sadly for Bruce, he'd spent most of his time fighting for his country's independence. It's believed that his good friend, Sir James Douglas, hung the heart of Bruce around his neck when he embarked on a voyage to the Holy Land. Sadly, Douglas never made it, as he was killed at Tiba, near Andalusia, so the heart was returned to Scotland and interred at Melrose Abbey, and you can see the place of the burial, which is well marked at the side of the chapter house. The abbey had around 100 monks, and using new farming techniques, developed an incredible wool marketing trade with connections across Northern Europe. The town of Melrose grew up around the abbey, and now the town benefits from the romantic ruins right in this centre. And there's lots to do in Melrose. For example, if you're a hiker, then walk up the Eildon Hills, strongly recommended, for fabulous views across the border countryside. Of course, I should have mentioned another long-distance footpath walk called the Border Abbey's Way, which is a circular walk around the Scottish borders and takes in Kelso, Jedburgh, Melrose and Dryburgh Abbeys. It's around 68 miles long, 109 kilometres, and is a very pleasant way to spend a weekend in this lovely area. The route also passes through the border towns of Hawick and Selkirk, and close to Abbotsford, the home of Sir Walter Scott. It was opened in 2006 and links up with 4 of the other great trails, the Cross Borders Drove Road, the Romans and Reivers route, St Cuthbert's Way, and the Southern Upland Way, and more about the Reivers shortly. Well, it's now time to leave Melrose and head back to Edinburgh via the A7, but before we do, we can't leave the borders without visiting Sir Walter Scott's house at Abbotsford, a stone's throw from Melrose. Scott's decision to live in the borders was not surprising, as that's where he was brought up and learned so many of the stories that would fill pages of his future books. He was also Sheriff Deputy of Selkirk, a town not far from Abbotsford, and when he bought Clarty Hole, as it was nicknamed, he had a vision of living in his own castle, designed in his own style, which encapsulated almost every architectural detail of the history that he described in his books. Sorry, you might have heard a dog barking in the background. I just opened the window just for a moment, and it's little Willow next door, a wee terrier, that decided to have a bark to himself. So thank you, Willow, for your interjection. Anyway, to continue about Scott, he himself described the resulting building as a sort of romance in architecture, a kind of conundrum castle to be sure. And when you look at Abbotsford today, it has so many features of the past with a Scottish baronial style that includes turrets, stepped gables, arrow loops, holes, crosses and crenellations that are found on so many mock castles of the 19th century. But inside is a treasure trove of historical artefacts, gathered by Scott to reflect almost every historical incident of the past. He has suits of armour, medieval weapons, an old lock taken from the toll booth in Edinburgh, as well as the huge key, oak-panelled ceilings with coats of arms, and much more. And it's interesting to note how many of these artefacts actually featured in his books. The house gives a real insight into Scott's character and is a must-visit if you're in the area. In my previous podcast, Borders Episode 1, I mentioned Scott and where he was born in Edinburgh and how he was raised in the Borders. Well, this house is where he died. It was a sad ending for such an amazing man. Effectively, he had invested in a printing business and, during a UK-wide banking crisis in 1825, his Ballantine printing business collapsed with debts of £130,000, or 13.5 million in today's money. Now, he could have declared himself bankrupt and moved on, and he was offered actually much financial support from friends, even from the king himself, but Scott was too proud to do either, and he declared that he would continue to write to clear his name. He placed his house and income in a trust belonging to his creditors and set out to write his way out of the debt. To add to his burdens, his wife Charlotte died 1 year later. Well, he kept to his word, and between 1826 and 1832, he produced 11 works of non-fiction, 6 novels, 2 plays and 2 short stories. The non-fiction work included The Life of Napoleon Bonaparte and 2 volumes of the history of Scotland, an incredible achievement in such a short time. As time went on, his health started to fail from his extreme work schedule, so in 1831 he took time off to voyage to Malta and Naples on board HMS Barham, a Royal Navy frigate put at his disposal. Such was the esteem of this man. He was celebrated everywhere he went. Sadly, on his return home, disaster. He took a steamboat called the Prince Frederick and had a major stroke near Emmerich in northwest Germany. He was just well enough to return to Scotland and his beloved Abbotsford, and, as he could not climb the stairs to his bedroom, he asked for his bed to be placed by the window in the dining room where he could look out onto his beloved River Tweed. A short while later, on 21st of September 1832, he died, aged 61. His grave can be found at Jedburgh Abbey alongside his wife Charlotte. Although he had not cleared all his debts by the time of his death, his novels continued to sell, and the money raised was able to ensure that all his debts were discharged not long afterwards. I have to say, I do love visiting Abbotsford with its quirky architecture, wonderful garden, and the innumerable collections of artefacts inside this conundrum castle, as Scott himself called it. Nearly every item on display has appeared in one of his books, but I suppose I like to visit just to get a feel for the place where this great man penned his masterpieces, and to try to get a sense of how his work affected every aspect of Scottish life and history in the 19th century. This is a must-see on your visit to the Borders.
Hi John, coffee?
An excellent time to take a break. Yes, please. Well, that was Pam just popping in to ask if I'd like a coffee, so I'll take a quick break. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you can contribute to the podcast by buying a coffee, and you just go to your browser, buymeacoffee.com/Unique Scotland. So I'll be back very shortly. And our final visit to an abbey town in the Borders is to Selkirk, and on leaving Melrose we drive southwest for 5 miles on the A7, arriving at the very pretty village of Selkirk and the town where Sir Walter Scott was deputy sheriff. As you enter the market street, you'll see a large life-size statue of Scott in front of the 19th century townhouse where he worked. The townhouse replaced the old toll booth in around 1800, and you can't miss this classical building with a 5-tier clock tower. It's super. Selkirk is one of the oldest royal boroughs in Scotland, with a history dating back to before the 12th century. The name comes from the old Scots word meaning the church by the forest, which refers to Ettrick Forest nearby. The forest is well known as the place where William Wallace was declared guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland in 1297, after his victory against a much larger English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. And of course, you've seen the Braveheart film. Well, I'm sure you remember Mel Gibson's immortal ending, Freedom! It was actually in Selkirk that the first abbey in Scotland was established in 1113 by King David I and populated by Tyronnensian monks. It was, however, only in existence for 15 years when the abbey was moved to Kelso, and as far as my research goes, there appears to be no trace of the original abbey. Well, it's now time to start heading back to Edinburgh, and we're going to take another route through the Borders on the A7 via Galashiels, which was one of the first border towns that I got to know. Gala, as it's known locally, is only 6 miles north of Selkirk. It has a considerable history with the textile industry and is now a major commercial centre for the Borders region. It's also the location of Heriot-Watt University's School of Textiles and Design. The town's coat of arms are interesting in that they show 2 foxes reaching up to eat plums from a tree. The town's motto is Sour Plums, or as pronounced in Scots dialect, Sour Plums. This goes back to an incident in 1337 when a raiding party of English soldiers who who were picking wild plums in the local area were caught by men from Gala and, in the ensuing fight, all the soldiers were killed. There's an interesting equestrian statue in the centre of the town, and it's a statue of a Border Reiver, and it's in front of the borough chambers which replaced the old toll booth in the 19th century. More of the Reivers shortly, but I mentioned that Gala was the first border town that I visited, and that's when I was only 16 years old. I had just left school and was waiting to decide what to do with the rest of my life, when my elder sister Marlene asked if I wanted to work in the woolen mills in the borders. Now, it was good money, so I jumped at the chance and was soon joining the mill workers on the bus that took us from our village near Dalkeith for an hour's journey south to work in the Gala woolen mills. I was assigned to a professional warper. Now, a warper took a thread from a large number of bobbins and stretched them onto a rotating drum or loom in a particular pattern. Once this was done, we sent the drum to the weavers, who introduced the weft to make the fabric. Well, I hope you followed all that. It was interesting work, and I soon got to know many of the workers, the majority of whom were women, as that was the predominant workforce in the woolen mills at the time. And as a fresh-faced, fair-haired, blue-eyed 16-year-old lad, I was rather spoiled by all the ladies, and even had my bum pinched occasionally, although I did rather enjoy the attention, so didn't complain, but then again, one never did in those days. And this is also where I met my girlfriend from Lauder, who I mentioned in the first episode of my Borders podcast. You remember the one that I would walk 500 miles for? Well, it was a good start to my working life, but I had other aspirations, and after only 4 months as a warper, I left to start an incredible adventure at sea in the Royal Navy, and never looked back. If that story would interest you, let me know and I'll look to do a podcast on my life at sea, with the juicy bits as well. Well, as we head north, we'll soon be leaving the Borders region, but before we do, I want to mention the Border Reivers, who were raiders, pillagers and livestock rustlers within the Borders region from the late 13th century to the early 18th century. The word reeve actually comes from the Scots word reefin, and the verb reeve means to plunder or to rob. Now, reiving affected the whole of the Borders region, on both the Scottish and English side. And to understand why this banditry was so prevalent during this period, you have to understand the people who lived in this region and how badly they were affected by the ongoing wars between England and Scotland. Their livelihoods were often devastated by advancing or retreating armies. The border region was also far from the seat of power and often forgotten about, so local clans took advantage of this lawlessness to enrich their own families. The hills and mountains of the Borders region also makes it unsuitable for arable farming, and the livestock that was reared on this land was easily stolen by rival families. To try to protect their lands, a local laird would appoint a leading townsperson as a warden who would ride the borough's boundaries, or marches as they were called, to ensure protection of common land in an attempt to prevent encroachment by neighbouring boroughs. I suppose a good comparison would be with the first cowboys of the American Wild West, where reiving had its own outlaws, self-regulated lawmakers, strong family ties, corrupt officials, greed, misery, and a continuous struggle for survival. Raiding other families' land, using arson, murder and kidnapping were commonplace. But in amongst this turmoil, squalor, deceit and treachery, there was also glamour, great acts of courage and loyalty. It all came to an end in 1603, when the crowns of Scotland and England were joined by James VI of Scotland becoming James I of England, when he set about unifying the two countries. The posts of wardens and the marches were abolished, and the term borders was changed to the Middle Shires. No borderer was allowed to carry a weapon, and livestock holdings were reduced. Powerful families who were prominent in reiving were dispossessed of their lands, their homes were destroyed, and the individuals scattered or deported. Wanted men were hunted down and executed. I suppose the upshot is that the borderers' descendants, who are scattered throughout the world, are still displaying strength of character, resilience and leadership acquired through those eventful and bloody years. President Nixon and Neil Armstrong, to name but a few. I'm pleased to say that after all these years and bad memories have faded, some traditions are remembered and continue to be celebrated. One of the most prominent summer events in the Borders region is the annual Common Riding, or Riding of the Marches. Each town has its own common riding on a particular festival day. Some towns actually reenact their historic common ridings, where male and female horsemen ride out of the town, along its borders or marches, and this has become one of the most celebrated equestrian events of the year. I was in Galashiels for one of these events, and in this town it's called the Braw Lads Gathering, braw being a Scots word for good, pleasing or even good looking. It was an extraordinarily colourful event, with flags, banners and the braw lad and lass at the head of the event. Certainly something to witness if you're visiting Scotland. There's even a poem by Robert Burns, The Braw Lads of Gala Water. It's a poem of a young woman who's fallen in love with a braw lad, and regardless of the fact that he's not rich, she loves him with all her heart. And in typical Robert Burns fashion, at the end of the poem it's not riches that matter in life, but the bliss of mutual love that is the world's treasure. Here it is, and I soften the Scots language to make it more understandable, so forgive me you Scots out there who think this is blasphemy. I think the only Scots you may not understand is meikle tocher, which means not much dowry. Anyway, here we go. Braw lads on yarrow braes, they rove among the blooming heather, but yarrow braes nor electric shaws can match the lads of Gala Water. But there is one, a secret one, above them all I love him better, and I'll be his and he'll be mine, the bonny lad of Gala Water. Although his daddy was no laird, and though I hae nae meikle tocher, yet rich is kindness, truest love, we'll tend our flocks by Gala Water. It never was wealth, that coft contentment, peace or pleasure, the bands and bliss of mutual love, oh that's the chiefest world's treasure. And thank you again to Robert Burns, Scotland's national bard, for a lovely poem and for reminding us all that money can't buy you everything. Well folks, our drive north from Galashiels will see us pass through the coal mining towns of Gorebridge and Newtongrange, where I grew up, and 40 minutes later we arrive back in Edinburgh to end our tour of this amazing part of Scotland. I do love to share this Scotland with you in my podcasts, and I appreciate all the kind words from people from all over the world. As you can imagine, a lot of research as well as personal knowledge goes into the work, and if you would like to contribute in a small way, you can always join me in buying a coffee for around $5 or £3.50 by searching buymeacoffee.com/Unique Scotland. And that will take you to a payment page. It's easy peasy, buymeacoffee.com/Unique Scotland. Any contributions are much appreciated. Well, before I leave you, I'd like to give a shout out to two groups of guests who've travelled with me through Scotland recently. The first is a family of 4, Jim and Linda Wood, and their 2 daughters, Christy and Ginny. And a special shout out to Josh, Ginny's son, who could not travel to Scotland this time. Josh, we're thinking of you, and we do hope you can make it to Scotland one day. You'll hear from them shortly, but I just have to share an incredible story of how they met a near relative that they never knew existed. One of Jim's main aims on the trip was to visit the town of Eyemouth, a small fishing village about 50 miles southwest of Edinburgh, and that was to remember his great-grandfather who died during the Eyemouth fishing boat disaster of 1881, where a terrible storm took the lives of 189 fishermen, most of whom were from Eyemouth, when their fishing boats were smashed upon the rocks at the entrance to the harbour. The wives and the children were on shore watching the tragedy unfold. In the end, it left 78 widows and 182 fatherless children in the town. One of the boats was the fishing vessel Harmony, and Jim's great-grandfather, William Angus, was on board. Sadly, he lost his life that day. I took the family down to Eyemouth to the museum where the records show the names of all the fishing boats and the men who were lost there. I walked in first with the family behind me, and as I approached the desk to speak to Margaret, the museum's manager, I overheard another man talking to her and asking for details of none other than the same fishing vessel, the Harmony. I was intrigued, so I asked the gentleman, a Reverend Stephen Gardner, why he was interested in this boat in particular, and he said that his great-great-grandfather, Peter Angus, was on board and died when it sank on that fateful night. I have to say, the hairs stood up in the back of my neck. It was just too much of a coincidence. His great-great-grandfather, Peter Angus, and my guest Jim's great-great-grandfather, William Angus, died that night, and both from the fishing vessel Harmony. I said to the gentleman that he should be prepared to meet a long-lost cousin when Jim and the rest of the family walked in. They shook hands, and, after comparing notes, it was confirmed that their respective great-great-grandfathers were brothers. Well, you could have knocked me down with a feather. What an amazing moment of serendipity. The brothers died side by side on the fishing vessel Harmony in 1881, and 140 years later, Their grandchildren, one from Northern England and one from North America, total strangers, should happen to visit their resting place at exactly the same time. I have to say that I felt extremely honoured to have witnessed this very special moment. Well, there were hugs all round, and as you can imagine, a few tears as well, and I'm pleased to say that they'll be staying in touch for some time to come. Before the family flew back to the USA, I had a chance to discuss the tour over the past 10 days, and I asked them what was the highlight of their time in Scotland, and this is what they said.
I'm just dropping the Wood family off now, and we've had a great time. But Jim, what was the highlight for you?
The main purpose of our trip was to introduce our daughters to our family and learn about our family history. And along the way, we encountered some relatives that we didn't even know existed. So it was in Eyemouth and in Inverary where we met relatives face to face. It was wonderful. The one thing that I also like to find is the Scottish people. They're down to earth, they're basic, they're friendly, and they're real. They're not phony. So we really enjoyed meeting the people that we did.
Thanks, Jim. Linda, your highlight?
There's so many, but I loved all of the lammies that we saw and the beautiful forested areas and the flowers and meeting the Scottish people in person.
Fabulous. And Ginny?
Well, our time in Eyemouth was definitely the most poignant and certainly unforgettable, but I really enjoyed the scenery and the drive around Skye. Just spectacular.
Thank you, Ginny. Christy?
I also have to say there is nothing that compares to the experience we had in Eyemouth. And likewise, the scenery in Scotland and on the Isle of Skye was fabulous. But I have to say the Cairngorm Mountains were beautiful, and the heather was in bloom, and it was spectacular.
Super. Well, Pammy and I, my co-driver and also co-host, have thoroughly enjoyed your company. So thank you so much to one and all. So bye for now.
And shout out to Jordan from Glasgow, who's with the Porsche dealership. He was quite enjoyable.
That's a guy they met in a pub one evening, and sounds like quite a character. So Jordan, if you're listening to this, well done, sir. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye for now.
And my very best wishes to the Wood family. And Josh, we're thinking of you. My next guests were also from America, and they travelled with me, running out of Edinburgh for a couple of days, and they were Mary Ann and Jeff Edwards. On the first day, we went to the wonderful area of the Trossachs next to Loch Lomond in the south of Scotland. The second day, we visited the Borders area, and I made sure that we visited Abbotsford House that I mentioned earlier, the home of the great Scottish writer Sir Walter Scott. My main reason for ensuring that we visited Abbotsford was that Mary Ann is an author herself. She writes murder mysteries, the Charlie McClung series, and if you haven't tried them, then do. They're gripping detective stories that will keep you guessing until the end. Her first book, Brilliant Disguise, is an absolute cracker, but it was inspired by a horrific real-life incident when she received the terrible news that her sister Sherry had shot herself and was in a life-threatening condition. Later, at the hospital, 2 surgeons confirmed that she had indeed been shot, but it was in the back. So how could she have shot herself? It's an intriguing read, and you will be astonished when you find out who the main suspect was. And remember, this is a take on a real story. Well, thank you for sharing this with me, Mary Ann. And as I said, one of our last visits on our tour was to the fabulous Abbotsford House, and I could see how connected Mary Ann was to a fellow writer. I asked her how the trip had gone.
Well, we've just left Abbotsford House, and I have to say it was an absolutely super visit. Mary Ann and Jeff are with me at the moment, just heading back to the car before we head back to Edinburgh to finish our trip. And give me a few words as to how you felt for the last couple of days, Mary Ann.
I felt pampered. I mean, I didn't have to think about anything or worry about anything, and I saw so many great sights. Now I have to go home and make my own very Scottish flower garden. But everything was just super interesting. I mean, it was just things that I've never seen before, and hopefully I may see them again. But the countryside, the museums, just everything was just absolutely superb. Thanks to John and Pammy.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, and as an author yourself,
yes,
of the McClung series,
yes,
But having seen Abbotsford House, the great Scottish writer Sir Walter Scott, what do you reckon?
I want the house.
You want the house?
I need my library to look like that. I want a little sliding door or whatever. That's just my dream library right
Fantastic.
there.
And Jeff, of course, walking slowly behind you. Any comment, Jeff, on your little last 2 days?
I agree.
I love it.
It was wonderful. You think you know about Scotland and what you see and what you read, and just getting that in-depth tour without being overwhelming. Everything was interesting. Sir Walter Scott, I think the house reflects the man. It is interesting, to say the least. It's been a great couple of days and great tour. We appreciate it.
That's my pleasure. So we're just jumping in the car now and heading back to the Auld Reekie, Bonnie Edinburgh. Thank you.
And that was Mary Ann and Jeff Edwards, and very best wishes to you both. I know you got home safe, and hopefully we'll see you back in Scotland again. Well, my next adventure will take me, or should I say us, to East Lothian, an area along the coast of the east of Edinburgh, from the town of Musselburgh, through Longnidrey, my own village of Aberlady, Gullen, North Berwick, all the way down to Dunbar. To the south of the country we have the southern uplands mentioned in episode 1. East Lothian has some amazing coastline, fabulous beaches, with a seabird colony on the Bass Rock with 150,000 northern gannets, which is the largest gannet population in the world. There's castles, grand houses, and an aircraft museum housing a Concorde aircraft, and golf courses galore. There's great history too, with Bonnie Prince Charlie scoring a hit against the British Army at Preston Pans, and Mary Queen of Scots' final downfall on Carberry Hill near to Musselburgh. So don't miss this episode covering a superb part of Scotland. Well, as always, I thoroughly enjoyed bringing a part of Scotland to you. I always welcome feedback, so if you wish to comment on any of the areas we visited today, or if you wish me to cover any aspect of Scottish life, then please get in touch through the contact page on my website, or send an email to info@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I'm also delighted to have met many of you personally who have listened to the podcast. And as it happens, I was taken by surprise by Lisa at Culloden Battlefield last week, who is a podcast listener, and she recognised me from my Facebook and also my website. That's a first. So Lisa, thank you very much indeed for coming up and saying hello, and we did a short recording and I'll play that on the next podcast. So Lisa and Jan, listen out. Do please keep your messages of support coming, and don't forget, if you do intend visiting Scotland without a formal guide, then perhaps one of my bespoke itineraries may help you plan a more spectacular holiday. Well folks, it's been a pleasure to have you all listening today, and I would now like to sign off in traditional Scottish fashion by raising my glass with a wee dram, perhaps the Highland Park, to you wherever you are in the world. Slàinte.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.